Welcome to YourTown television program from Monterey. My name is Carol McKibben, and I'm the director of a new, exciting history project in Salinas. My guests today are Mr. Sherwood Darrington, who is the managing director of the Agricultural Land Trust in Salinas since 1984, and Mr. Pete Anderson, who is a sixth generation Danish, from a Danish immigrant family in Salinas. And we're going to talk a little bit about Salinas history today. Both of their work in Salinas, all of our work in Salinas, and try to come to grips with where Salinas is going in the present.
Right.
But we need to begin with the past in order to understand that. And we want to look at the various ways that people in Salinas are contributing to the health and well-being of the city. So this begins with you, gentlemen. And when we were talking earlier, I mentioned a quotation that I like to think about when I start working on a project on a city. And it was by a British essayist who was referring to Rome. And he said that Rome was a great city, not because in and of itself it was a great city. It was a great city because people made it great. People loved Rome not because it was already wonderful. They loved Rome was wonderful because they loved it. And even though it might be a little bit of a stretch to think about Salinas and compare it to Rome, I wanted to begin this segment by talking about your memories of Salinas and why you love this place. What do you think makes Salinas a great city, and how are you remembering it going back in time? So I wanted to start with you, Sherwood, since your family goes all the way back to the 19th century. Well, actually, both of your families go all the way back to the 19th century. And your great-great-grandfather actually laid out plans for the city. So if you could begin by telling me a little bit about why you love Salinas, what makes it great to you, what your memories are. We can just kind of start with that.
Yeah, well, Salinas history and my family history goes together, for many generations. If you look at the location of Salinas, it's on a Rancho Grande, and that's the El Sal Rancho Grande. That was perfected by a man by the name of Jacob Lease. Mm-hmm. And he hired a carpenter by the name of Tresconi to do some work on the ranch house that located on there. And Mr. Lease paid him off by giving him 60 acres. And that's where the halfway house in Salinas original building was built.
So when you say a Rancho Grande, what you're referring to is a moment in time when California was actually Mexico, and the Mexican government granted land to encourage settlement of California. They wanted this place settled. So did he receive his grant from the Mexican government, or are we talking about the period after the war with Mexico in the 1850s?
It would be after the period because it was perfected with the United States government.
Okay, so the United States government then looked at that parcel of land that had originally been designated by Mexico and began to divide the land up among new residents of California, the new American settlers. And your great-great-grandfather was part of that.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And those grants were basically between about 4,000 acres to about 48,000 acres in size.
That's significant.
Throughout Monterey County. Uh-huh. My great-grandfather bought the ranch from Lease, and it had like 10,000 acres in it at that particular time. And Tresconi sold his 60 acres to a Riker, a man by the name of Riker, and Jackson, and they wanted to build a town, and they approached my great-grandfather because his land surrounded him on three sides, and so they got together And that's when they laid out the original plan for Salinas.
And fortuitously, Salinas is located right on the path of the railroad.
Well, the railroad came through Salinas.
Okay.
Salinas was a crossroad between the stage stops between Los Angeles and San Francisco and Monterey and San Juan Bautista. And so that's why Salinas got its start in its present location.
So your 19th century roots really involved the creation of the city from the very, very beginning.
Yeah. In fact, 3/4 of the town of Salinas today sits on the land that my great-grandfather used to own.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Right, yeah.
And you're still here and you're still a resident. Right. So your love for this place is really deep-seated. Yeah. It goes all the way back and it's rooted in place. And your role now, and we'll talk about this in the second segment, as the managing director of the Ag Land Trust, is all about the land. Yeah. All about the land. So I want to switch a little bit and talk about Pete Andreessen's roots in Salinas, which are part and parcel. I know that you have Scotch-Irish descendants, but not that we don't care about them, but we want to focus on a really interesting migration that not a lot of people know about, and that is the migration of people from Denmark in the middle of the 19th century. Germany invaded, took a very significant portion of Denmark, and many people were displaced and came to the United States at that time as refugees.
Right.
And we welcomed them in large part because they were Northern European, we liked that, and they were Protestant. And we were a little nervous about all the Catholics who were coming by way of Ireland. So when the Danes came, even though they were poor and even though they were refugees, we wanted them to come. And we developed policies and practices that not only encouraged their migration, but also their settlement. And I think that your family came in the 1840s, 1850s, and then the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed people like your
the
ancestors, that's the word I'm looking for, sorry, to own land and in that way become American citizens.
Yeah, we're searching for it on the web. What we found is that the first the scout for the mothership came over here in 1849 for the gold rush, sailed around the Horn, set up his life near Lincoln, and what happened
Lincoln,
was
Nebraska?
Lincoln, California.
Lincoln, California.
And what happened was something happened in 1863 where 3 members of his family suddenly died in one day. And we can't figure out yet what that was.
Cholera, perhaps?
Could be. It was Copenhagen. You can actually go to the building in Copenhagen, right on the water. It was a ship's chandlery where he'd sent the money back for the family to create the chandlery. And the 14-year-old son survived it, got on a ship, sailed around the Horn without any announcement he was coming, and showed up. And at that point, they moved to Salinas, even though there wasn't a town yet. So they were in the Salinas Valley, working in lumbering. There used to be a lot more redwoods, I get the impression.
Yes.
And they worked on cattle ranching.
Okay,
mostly.
So they were ranchers.
Right.
The Danes were also great fishermen,
right?
Obviously. So there was a reason for the Danish immigration to California.
Right.
In fact, now there are more Danish descendants in California than in any other state of the nation. We have over 200,000 people who identify as Danish. So that immigration isn't always acknowledged or known, but it certainly is part of Salinas history.
Right.
And it's a very, very diverse and multicultural history, as is all of California.
Yeah.
So in the 19th century, both of your families were part of the beginning of this city. And in fact, your great-grandfather laid out the city's space. But, the 19th century now passes, so we move into the 20th century. And as we move into the 20th century, we see something really significant taking place in Salinas that doesn't take place up and down the coast of California necessarily. And that is tremendous city building and it is based on agriculture and agricultural development. So when we think about Salinas in that era, in the period between 1898, the Spanish-American War, and the 1920s, and it covers the period of World War I. This is still before our time. We're not in our time yet.
Right.
But that era was a very, very significant turning point, and really, some might argue, created an urban center here.
Yes.
Would you like to speak, either of you like to speak to that moment?
Well, there was a big change in agriculture during that era.
Which was?
Was from cattle through
wheat,
for hides originally, and for some meat production, and a watershed or a milk shed for San Francisco. And irrigation came into being, particularly when Spreckles built a sugar factory here, and so the agriculture changed at that time, and it became more important not only to the Salinas Valley but to the United States because of what it was being produced and what it's later now changed into what it's producing today as well.
So Salinas in the Paleolithic,
Right.
if we're really going to go back in time, was a swampland, pretty much. But it did always have this incredibly rich soil as a result of that. And this transformation of agriculture that you identified, that of course we know from East of Eden, John Steinbeck, really was about not just preservation, the establishment of an ice factory in Salinas, and the development moving from cattle. The cattle industry ended in California with the droughts and the floods of the late 19th century and the economic crashes of that era, 1873, 1893. Suddenly the cattle industry is no more. We see the rise of wheat farming, but we also see this transportation system and this technology developing in Salinas. And you alluded to the financial investment of San Francisco that allowed the technology to develop. And you hinted that now Salinas is not just serving the region with food, but the country as a whole. And that has everything to do with technological innovation, the establishment not just of ice, but of a new industry in beans and lettuce, and the ability to market that through places like Chicago, getting goods, getting agriculture to market meant everything.
Right.
It had to be preserved with ice, and then it had to be transported. And the railroads did that, transportation systems did that in the teens and 20s. Do you have anything to add to that, Pete?
Well, the other thing was the rise of technology at the same time. We still have our home in the 1894 building that my great-grandparents built.
Wow.
And what's fascinating is that you went from a town which had a large living space, a large footprint, because you had to have a horse and a garden. And when that became less of a deal, when the car came along, you see, if you drive through Salinas in the old section, you can see a Victorian house and then a house in the 20s, and then a Victorian house and then a house in the 20s, and that's them using up their horse lot and selling it. Also, you see the alleys go away, so you can see as you drive along by Roosevelt School, you can see these short little houses, and those are filling in the alleys they used to have for the horse manure that they don't shovel anymore. The outhouses stopped, and if you look at all the old houses, you can see the exterior plumbing, right? Because the plumbing had to be added to these houses. They didn't have piped water. Now they did. At the turn of the century, they developed piped water, they developed electricity. And so you see outhouses go away, external kitchens are going away, and you see the city filling in. If you look at old pictures of Salinas, when your great-great-grandfather first developed it, everybody has a big lot because you've got to have your own space and you have your own horse, own garden.
An own outhouse.
Yeah, and your own outhouse.
Well, what you're saying really complements one another because you're talking about technological development that created the city, that brought money into the city.
Right.
And that led to structures being built, especially in the progressive era, in the period of the teens and 20s, that are still with us today,
Yes.
that are hugely significant. And in the second segment, we're going to talk about your complementary work, because your Pete is focusing on the built environment and the preservation of those buildings and that history. But Sherwood is focusing on the preservation of the land itself, this rich land that allowed the technology purpose. It gave it purpose. If it weren't for the proliferation of vegetables and crops in Salinas, none of this would have happened. So the investment followed and drove the development of the land, which followed and drove the development of the city.
Right.
It goes hand in hand.
Yes.
And so we end this periodization with World War I and the progressive era and the new built environment that Salinas is becoming. By the 1920s, by the post-World War I period, we've got a city.
Right.
We've got a city. Agreed?
Yes.
Agreed.
Okay. Any other quick comments before we go to segment 2?
Well, I think that growing up in a city, in the 50s when I grew up in there, it still had a city core to it, and one high school, and everybody mixed together at that time, and everybody was really friendly, and it was a great place to live, a great place to play.
Thank you.
Yes.
And we'll continue with
Right.
that. And so we'll take a little break, and then we'll go into the great place to live, the community that was created in the 30s and 40s. And with that, we'll take a little break.